Okay, so let's get into it. Tonight's webinar is what we're calling deal killers. First off, on your screen, pay attention more to the speakers. We have, okay, there we go. Thank you. With a project update is Ralph Silberstein. Ralph is the president of the CEA Foundation, and with over 16 years of experience working on mine issues, he is an invaluable resource in this effort. Ralph served as a Grass Valley Planning Commissioner and is also a retired contractor. Next, we'll have Mike Shea. He is a volunteer with CEA. Mike is also an impacted homeowner that lives near the mine site and has in-depth knowledge of the potential impacts on well owners and groundwater. After that, we have Greg Thrush telling us more about mine waste disposal. Greg has a wide range of experience, including public health research and environmental health, including the impacts of legacy mining contaminants and water quality in the Sierra and Grass Valley. And finally, we're joined tonight by Martin Webb. Martin is the longtime host of KVMR's An Energy Report. It's now called the Climate Report, and is a local solar energy expert with a career spanning several decades and ownership of many local solar companies. Many of the names you might recognize: Planet Solar, Sierra Solar, and Cal Solar Electric Company. So you can see after that presentation, we'll have our Q&A, and then we'll finish with what you can do this summer to take action. So let's move on to the next slide. So without further ado, with a project update to set the table and give us some more context of what we're doing now that the DIR has been released, I'm handing it over to Ralph Silberstein, the president of CEA Foundation.
Thank you, Tracy. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick report on recent events. In case you missed it, this picture is from the March 24th Planning Commission meeting for the Idaho-Maryland Mine Draft Environmental Impact Report, or Draft EIR. We counted 482 people who showed up, and only one person of 100+ speakers spoke in favor of the mine. Of note, we were well received. The Planning Commission was very impressed with how civil and on topic everyone was, and thanked us. Next slide, please. So the draft environmental impact period officially ended on April 4th, but to me, it seems like April 1st was more appropriate, because Rise Gold continued to claim that the project basically had no impacts. I kept imagining, April Fool's, investors. The project has numerous additional significant impacts that the draft EIR missed. Anyway, Nevada County Planner Matt Kelly said that it looks like there were over 1,000 comments. We submitted a letter on behalf of our coalition of 20 organizations, and we submitted extensive legal comments as well as additional general comments, and we had a number of comments from experts. The draft EIR, the overwhelming consensus is it needs to be recirculated. Even the city of Grass Valley said that the draft needs to be recirculated. But the county has yet to make any determination on recirculation, and reportedly, they are still processing the comments. Under California law, the draft EIR must be recirculated if there is a significant information that was not included initially, or if the draft EIR is so fundamentally and basically inadequate and conclusory in nature that meaningful public review and comment are precluded. This draft EIR fails on both points. Okay, we're already on the slide that I'm on now, which is a number of additional studies will have to be done. The impacts will need to be adequately identified, and appropriate mitigations detailed in a new draft EIR. It starts with gathering adequate data. For example, the Centennial Cleanup Project currently conditions, that is the baseline, need to be detailed, and impacts from the cleanup assessed. Well monitoring. To get a groundwater baseline has to be done before the project is started as part of the draft EIR. Extensive vine rock testing is needed to evaluate the potential toxic hazards, and there need to be realistic construction schedules. Instead of the ridiculous 1 year that was listed, it will be more like 7 years before any gold could be produced. Many other items need additional information. Once that's all gathered up, then a revised draft EIR needs to be published. And then we'll have a repeat of the public comment period and hearings. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are just learning about the mine, what is the Centennial Project? Not to be confused with the Centennial Dam or the historic Idaho-Maryland Mine site, excuse me, the historical Idaho-Maryland Mine site on Idaho-Maryland Road in Centennial Drive is covered with an old mine waste that is toxic and needs to be cleaned up. Rise Gold plans to dump more tailings on the site, so they need to clean up the 44 acres of mine waste first. This is being done under the supervision of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC. The DTSC is a separate agency, and the cleanup plan, or remedial action plan, or RAP as they call it, is not even approved, but the mine draft EIR pretended that it is already done. So once the final remedial action plan is published, and then there'll be a comment period, brief comment period, and we expect that later this month. And then final approval for that would follow at some later date. The final remedial action plan in response to public comments is now expected. Excuse me, I'm just repeating myself. So in our view is that the cleanup and all of its impacts must be included in the draft EIR for the mine. The DEIR should describe the current conditions of the site and assess all of the impacts of the cleanup and the mine together instead of breaking the mine project up into pieces and thereby disguising the true impact. Next slide, please. So there's an economic study that the Nevada County contracted to have done. And the consultant for that is apparently waiting for some evaluation of the draft EIR comments due to the possibility that the project description will change, which is a good thing. Our take is that the study will likely be less favorable to the mine than the study provided by Rise Gold, which has a number of defects. And that's about it. So back to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Ralph. That was really helpful, and it really gives us a really good overall understanding of what we can expect this summer and this coming year. And I think it really helps us before we delve into this topic. So next on board, we have Mike Shea. Mike, as I said, is a volunteer with the CEA Foundation, and he also lives right next to the mine site. Tonight, Mike is going to tell us a bit more about groundwater, water and potential well impacts. So take it away, Mike. Well, Mike, I think, here, let me start your video. You can start your video. So there you go.
Hello, everybody. As Tracy said, my section of the presentation will focus on the mine's potential impacts on groundwater and wells. So first, a little background. The next slide, please. Rise hired 2 firms to look at the effects the mine will have on hydrology. EMCO Environmental and Itasca out of Denver, Colorado. Itasca developed a 3D numerical groundwater flow model of the mine. So that's what you'll see here on the slide there. And using this numerical model and other analytical methods, historical data was used to simulate and evaluate the effects of mine dewatering on domestic wells above the underground mine works. Next slide, please. And based on their simulations and evaluations, the firms made estimates, predictions, and assumptions on how the mine will affect wells. According to the Idaho-Maryland Mine well mitigation plan that accompanied the draft EIR, all potentially impacted wells are located in the East Bennett Road area. Domestic water wells outside this area will not be impacted. Next slide, please. And as you may have heard, Rise says it will provide NID hookups for up to 30 properties currently using well water along East Bennett Road. So it sounds like Rise has everything covered. What can possibly go wrong? Well, we have consulted with other experts. ones that weren't paged for care reports for Rise Gold. And here's what our experts found. Next slide, please. The draft EIR does not accurately evaluate the project's impacts on wells because it relies on a flawed groundwater model. There are several reasons for this. Let's take a look at them. Baseline Environmental Consulting is a consulting firm hired by CEA's attorneys, and it points out that accurate predictions of groundwater behavior in fractured bedrock using models rarely occurs because there are different, unknowable fracture patterns in the bedrock. Next slide. The EIR acknowledges that baseline groundwater levels have not been established and wants to defer the collection of additional data to the future using a groundwater monitoring plan. But by then it will be too late because the mine would have already been approved and dewatering will have started. And this groundwater monitoring plan seeks to establish dewatering baseline levels, but not until after dewatering begins. So you get kind of how crazy that is? They're going to establish pre-dewatering baselines, but they're going to wait until they start dewatering. Also, the DEIR states that drawdowns of the water table are generally within the mineral rights boundary, but provides no explanation as to how it determines the water table drawdowns to be limited to the area within the mine's mineral rights boundary. According to Baseline Environmental, since the area surrounding the project site contains a fractured bedrock system, it is possible for water table drawdowns to extend beyond the mineral rights boundary. So the data doesn't cover a wide enough area. Next slide. Rather than using current data, the groundwater model was calibrated based on historical pumping rates and a single water level measurement from 64 years ago. Data used about private wells was old and limited to just a few years. Next slide, please. Oh, also, the groundwater model did not include the proposed access shaft Rise wants to put in, or other proposed mine features, all of which would contribute to the downward transmission of groundwater. Plus, there are 3 major faults and numerous minor faults in the mineral rights area. These impact the transmission of water and introduce a high level of uncertainty in the accuracy of a model which assumes geology is uniform. These are all elements that are critical for constructing a reliable groundwater model. And before the impacts of the mine dewatering can accurately be identified, a reliable groundwater model is needed. It is our position that the groundwater model is seriously deficient with respect to data reliability, initial conditions, and modeling assumptions, and does not accurately depict the project's impacts. Next slide, please. And there is another thing. The DEIR holds that a well isn't considered significantly impacted unless there is a 10% reduction of water. Nowhere in the DEIR is it explained how this arbitrary 10% reduction figure was chosen, nor is the 10% figure justified. What about low volume wells that barely supply enough water now? Any reduction might be too much for them. Keep in mind, Rise has no plans to provide water to well owners other than those on East Bennett Road. Next slide, please. As I previously mentioned, the groundwater model monitoring plan acknowledges that more groundwater level data is needed to assess, I'm having trouble talking there, the potential impacts of the project to groundwater levels. The DEIR and associated groundwater monitoring plan does not propose to monitor water levels in the actual wells that may be affected, but proposes to install 15 monitoring wells. No explanation has been given on how it was decided 15 wells would adequately represent the hundreds of other wells in the area, nor was information provided on how they arrived at the locations of the monitoring wells. This slide shows the locations of the monitoring wells represented by a red dot with crosshairs, with the mineral rights boundary shown by a double dotted line. I think you can see that there are large areas within the mineral rights area that do not have a monitoring well. nor are there any monitoring wells outside of the mineral rights boundary. And those wells might be affected too, we just don't know. So do these 15 wells make you feel comfortable that your well won't go dry? The bottom line is that the DEIR incorrectly concludes that the impacts to the wells are less than significant and any possible impact is already fully mitigated. We disagree. Next slide, please. This leads us to what we at CEA believe needs to be done to ensure well owners are protected from any impact the mine could have on their wells. These include completion of a detailed water supply well inventory for all wells within the mineral rights boundary, plus a substantial buffer zone. We would like to see details about each potentially affected well, such as the construction design, the type and use of the well, like is it domestic, is it for irrigation, is it industrial, the water demand, recharge rates, and seasonal variations in water levels, and the development of a plan for each well to ensure that an immediate alternate water supply can be provided should a well be impacted. This plan must ensure alternate water supplies will be provided throughout the 80-year lifetime of the mine and beyond. The question is, will the county protect its residents by requiring Rise to pay whatever is necessary to ensure well owners are not without water? Next slide, please. I'd like to end with two examples of how models and simulations can go wrong. First, you are no doubt already aware of what happened when an underground gold mine was opened in San Juan Ridge. After a bedrock fault was encountered, the water flowing into the mine greatly increased. A dewatering well was drilled to capture this excess water, but when the water was pumped out of this well, it caused significant water level declines in water supply wells north of the mine. What I want to point out is, before the mine was approved, a groundwater study was done, just like Rise has done. And if you read this groundwater study, you will see the same words used in the MCO and Itasca studies: modeling, simulations, predicted, estimated, and assumed. And the prediction that was made was that dewatering would have a minimal impact on neighboring wells. So as I hope you can see, models are not perfect. The second example concerns the Stillwater aggregate mine in Lemon Cove, California. Without getting into the specifics of the problems faced by well owners, a water consulting firm was hired to review the previously used data and groundwater evaluations. And this firm was able to demonstrate numerous contradictions and inconsistencies within the hydrological report that had previously been prepared. And guess who previously prepared that report? MCO, the same company that Rise Gold hired to do their report. The problems in Lemon Cove further illustrate the issues that can arise in hydrological studies. The bottom line here is that reopening a mine under the feet of an established residential and business area is a huge risk. History tells us that things do go wrong. The analysis and proposed mitigations presented in the DEIR are widely inadequate and completely fail to address the significant disruption and financial consequences that would befall local residents and businesses when things fail. So that's it for me, and back to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Mike. It was a wonderful presentation and very helpful. I encourage folks, again, if you're new to this, we have a great website and a page specifically devoted to water issues and groundwater. So please, I encourage you to visit that. You can look at some of the posts we have there, including a presentation by Dr. June Oberdorfer, a hydrogeologist who has looked at this issue. So next on board, we have Greg Thrush. Greg is a CEA volunteer, but his background is in public health and environmental health. Tonight, he'll be focusing on the mine waste issue and how that connects to our air and water and our environmental and public health. So without further ado, Greg Thrush.
Thanks, Tracy. And Mike, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Yeah, as Tracy said, I'm going to talk about mine waste and the impact on water and air quality tonight. hard rock mining creates large amounts of mine waste. We know that. And mine waste includes barren rock excavated in search of the mineralized ore rock and the tailings that are created as the ore rock is processed to extract gold. The Draft Environmental Impact Report, or DEIR, describes 3 ways to deal with the mine waste. Dump it on a suitable disposal site, sell the waste rock as a product, which has to meet certain standards before it can be sold to assure that it is not a source of contamination. Or 3, return the material back into the mine. I'm going to focus on surface disposal because it bears upon the impacts to water and air quality in our area. Of the 1,500 tons of rock excavated each day, 500 tons are returned back into the mine as backfill, which I just mentioned. And the rest ends up somewhere on the surface. That somewhere happens to be near the residential neighborhoods that border the New Brunswick mine site and the Centennial site that adjoins the industrial business park area off of Whispering Pines Drive near downtown Grass Valley. Under the current mine proposal, each day 500 tons of barren rock and 1,000 tons of mineralized ore rock are excavated and crushed underground to the size of about 6 inches. The broken rock is brought up to the surface. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you advance one more slide, Josie? Go forward, wrong direction, go forward. One more. There we go. So, nope, we're back to the, sorry, the Google thing is a little bit weird. Go forward 1, please. And while she's doing that, I will, yes, they're perfect. So go ahead and advance 1 slide in that image and bring up, there we go. So like I was saying, 1,500 pounds of rock are brought to the surface and each day. Some of it's crushed brought to the surface. The mineralized ore is processed, which results in fine sand tailings, and together with the remaining 6-inch size barren rock with fresh exposed surfaces, that becomes mine waste that will be put somewhere. And like I said, that somewhere is close to us. And so in terms of water quality impacts, it's really easy to think of rocks as unchanging. And could you advance 1 more slide, please? And then 1 more slide again. But actually, rocks are composed of mineral elements that interact with what's around them. And mine waste piles are actually dynamic physical and chemical systems. Next slide, please. Surface disposal exposes rock waste to conditions different than what are underground. Weathering, the exposure to water and oxygen, causes mine waste to undergo changes that leach metals into the fluids flowing through it. So depending on the chemical composition of the rock, these effluents can be hazardous. Next slide, please. So arsenic, iron, and manganese are 3 principal minerals of concern because they are abundant and naturally occurring elements in our region, and all are readily leachable metals. And if not properly managed, hazardous substances contaminate public waterways, get deposited on land where they dry and can become airborne. Water and dust are the primary exposure pathways to humans and other animals. And the state's Central Regional Water Control Board is tasked with assuring that discharges into public waters do not exceed established standards. And under the Title 27 of the California Codes and Regulations, effluent water quality data need to be used and are used to classify mining waste in order to determine whether containment will be required based on that data. And containment means making sure that toxic substances don't get into the public waterways. Next slide, please. So what does the DER say about mine waste? The short answer is practically nothing beyond where to put the stuff. According to the DEIR, there are no significant concerns about mine waste that would be produced by the mine's operations. Rise Gold collected drill core samples and hired a consulting firm to analyze the samples and characterize the geochemistry of the waste rock. The analyses concluded that the mine tailings would not generate acid. Acid rock drainage is one common environmental hazard that accelerates heavy metal leachates. This is all that the DEIR says about effluents coming from mine waste. Next slide, please. Waste rock and mine tailings that produce near neutral to alkaline pH effluents with elements such as arsenic are not mentioned at all in the DEIR. And this is a significant omission, given that both the historic Idaho-Maryland mine and the neighboring Empire mine contain documented high levels of arsenic in the mine waste piles produced by prior mining activities in this area. Next slide. A paper published in 2014 about arsenic associated with historical gold mining in the Sierra Nevada foothills found that waste piles at the Empire Mine Historical State Park contain high levels of arsenic. And this map you see shows the locations of some of the mining features. The waste rock piles are shown in light green. And it also shows some data points for arsenic concentrations on trails prior to remediation, which was determined by some field X-ray fluorescence scanning. Next slide. So this table comes from the same paper and represents the levels of heavy metals found in the various waste rock piles in the park mentioned on the far left. And the final two columns titled total metals exceeding criteria and as exposure point concentration both show which elements exceed the California health screening levels. That's the first column, the total metals exceeding criteria. And then the second column shows the kind of at what level each waste pile, the levels of arsenic concentrations in each place. So for reference, natural concentrations of arsenic in soil typically range from 0.1 to 40 milligrams per kilogram. And you can see in this chart that the arsenic exposure concentrations are significantly higher than that, like sometimes by an order of 1,000. What that tells us is that, sure enough, mine tailings have high arsenic. Next slide, please. So arsenic is a big concern. We know it's a big concern. It's always been a big concern, and it will continue to be a big concern if present mining proposals go forward. So the next thing I want to address is some air quality impacts. And in terms of air quality, in addition to the above-mentioned metals I talked about, silica and asbestos are substances of concern in mine waste because they are released when rocks are crushed, transported, and disposed of. Silica is essentially pulverized crystalline silica, or quartz, as we all know it. The size of the airborne silica particles determine the amount of risk. Larger particles, such as beach sand, for example, are not as great a concern because they are too large to inhale. Smaller particles can be inhaled deep into the lungs, where they can cause health impacts like silicosis. Serpentine rocks often coexist with gold-bearing quartz, and it does exist within the mineral boundary area of the proposed mine. Serpentine rock commonly contains asbestos. The crushing, hauling, and disposal of waste rock liberates the materials within it, including asbestos. And this possibility is acknowledged and discussed in the DEIR. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is, so we've got air quality issues and water quality issues. And I want to just review some of the comments that were made on the DEIR by some experts related to mine waste. So the DEIR does not contain any data that would serve as a basis for classifying waste rock or mill tailings. Given what is known about historic rock waste, what we just talked about, and the mill tailings contamination from past mines in the area and its potential to generate poor quality effluent that threatens water quality, The DER is negligent not to address this. The sampling that was submitted for analysis appears to be selective, and the DER's lack of documentation about how the samples were chosen, given that fact, it is not possible to determine if the sample is representative of the ore body that would be mined. Rise Gold completed 19 drill core holes, totaling about 67,500 linear feet of core sample, and in the years between 2017 and 2019. And from this drill core, Benchmark Resources, a consultant that they hired, collected 6 drill core samples that it used to characterize the geochemistry of the waste rock. The geochemical predictions for approximately 96% of the waste rock to be produced comes from one 10-foot interval of drill core and one 1-foot sample. That's it. So, the sampling and the analysis are inadequate at best and possibly inaccurate and misleading given its small size. So, and then about what the DER says about mitigating asbestos and silica. Next slide, please. Oh, this is the right slide, sorry. The DER makes no mention of silica, most likely because it's so pervasive, but it does talk about asbestos, to its credit. The asbestos management plan in the DEIR would ensure, or says that it would ensure the average mined material and engineered fill contains less than 0.01% asbestos. Testing the asbestos content, however, does not control the amount of asbestos in the actual material mined. To control the average amount of asbestos in output materials and to avoid significant impacts related to asbestos exposure, you have to test and potentially stockpile asbestos-rich material to mix it down to an acceptable level with other mine waste. And that is going to happen. They're going to encounter serpentine. There's going to be asbestos in some of the waste. Currently, the DER does not include any evidence that asbestos levels will not exceed this 0.01% threshold. And testing for asbestos is actually a little bit complicated and can require up to 2 weeks before the results are known. Yet the project calls for daily mining activity to continue during this time. The DER does not address how this would happen, given that the daily mine material might have to be stockpiled while awaiting the test results. Otherwise, the mine waste could just get trucked out and dumped without knowing what levels of asbestos it contains. Incidentally, so that's a problem. The DER doesn't discuss this at all, and it leaves me with questions and a lot of other people. And just one thing incidental to this about just hauling materials is that Rise Gold's business plan counts on eventually selling and trucking mine waste as a construction material. And the ability to do this is also regulated by the state and would also have to conform to the same contamination standards as local surface storage. So all the things we're talking about would apply to if they hauled rock out of the area and dumped it, sold it, or dumped it someplace else. So next slide, please. So just in conclusion, as I've really briefly outlined, DER has some serious omissions related to mine waste. And while mining technology advances in terms of its efficiency and has made improvements by abandoning some dangerous processes like the use of mercury, the byproducts of mining are not different than they were 150 years ago. And the environmental impacts of mine waste remain the same as well. Over the past 15 years, about $1 million in EPA brownfields funding has been allocated to our area just to help figure out how to remedy the contamination resulting from past mining activities. Mine waste is a significant environmental issue that still needs to be addressed in our area today. And operating a mine again in our area could mean a return to many of the same issues associated with prior gold mining efforts and potentially continue the complicated legacy problems of mine waste contamination that we have. The DEIR is supposed to describe what the environmental impacts of opening a mine and how those impacts will be addressed should the mine application be approved. The DEIR clearly fails to do this with regards to mine waste. Mine proponents talk about the benefits and the wealth created by mining gold, but are mute about the social and environmental burdens that our community bears in order to allow them to achieve their objectives. And it is not within the DEIR scope to assess the social costs borne by our community to host an industrial mining operation, but they are real. And so it is up to us to make sure that the issues are understood and communicated to our county's decision makers. That's all I've got for now, and thanks for your time and your attention.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're on mute. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know your presentation generated a lot of questions, and so coming back to those soon, yes. But last but not least, we do have Martin Webb. As I said before, Martin is the host of KVMR's Climate Report, and he's considered a regional solar expert and has been a local solar business owner 3 times over. Martin tonight is going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and the connection to the mine.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for attending. And indeed, similar to what you've heard from the other categories of environmental impact with greenhouse gas emissions, we feel as though they have measured wrong as well. They've missed emissions, and then they've also set the standards for what is significant incorrectly. So let's get started. We'll roll through this and get to the questions. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do 2 parts. The first part is how they have used a bad greenhouse gas yardstick. Bad yardstick, sit, no treat. Next slide. Because when it comes to greenhouse gases, they must set some sort of measurement. Click through, please. And just like you've heard with other impacts, when it comes to the DEIR, the question is, at what level do greenhouse gas emissions from this proposed project break into what's considered significant territory, which would require mitigation according to our state law? Click through, please. So they have to choose some sort of level that they consider significant. And anything below that level is completely fine. Click through, please. And so if you set a significance level that is fairly high, that means that they could pollute and they don't have to offset it. Click through. However, if the project exceeds that limit, then there are mitigations that must be taken to lower those emissions. And when we talk about mitigations, what we oftentimes don't talk about is anytime an environmental report says you must do this mitigation, that potentially increases the cost of the project. Next slide. So we feel as though that the DEIR uses the wrong yardstick for the wrong place at the wrong time. So let's talk about what yardstick they did use. Go ahead and click through, please. Because what they've done is they've looked at what some other California counties and air quality management districts have come up with, which was an arbitrary 10,000 metric tons a year of CO2 equivalent. That means that there are other greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide that make a difference, and they make them equal to CO2 and measure it. So to put that into perspective, though, 10,000 metric tons is equivalent to about 22 million pounds of CO2 that would be allowed. Now, that's shredding. Oops, you can go back, sorry. Yeah. Now, CO2 is 2 O's and 1 C, so it's not all carbon, and oxygen's a little bit heavier than carbon. So what they're saying is they would allow the shredding of a 6 million pound solid block of carbon every single year. The number is arbitrary and doesn't represent the best climate science and goals. But if you allow that as your threshold, then the mine could pollute that much every single year for almost a century and not have to do a single mitigation. Next slide. Now, we feel as though this is also the wrong yardstick for the wrong place. Click through. Because again, what they've done is they've looked at other counties and air quality management districts. They've come up with an arbitrary 10,000 metric tons a year. Click through. Now, our county and our air quality management district, which is known as Northern Sierra, have never set any numerical limits to use for this analysis, which is why the DEIR decided to shop around the state and see what they could find. I want to take a moment here, though, and say that just this week, the National Sunrise Movement that is working towards climate change has a push right now encouraging everyone to contact county representatives to set a greenhouse gas limit that projects like this could be used, because we are a completely different region than Southern California, the Bay, SAC, and we are close to Placer County. But for the most part, we're the tailpipe of the Bay in Sacramento. They don't have the greenhouse gas emissions and air quality problems that we do. Click through. So what we feel like is that this is information that's lifted from completely different parts of the state that really isn't appropriate to apply here. Next slide, please. Now, this is also an outdated yardstick. So it's not just the wrong time, the wrong place, it's also the wrong time. And what we mean by that is all of those other air quality districts set those standards years ago before the Paris Climate Accord set their new global goals, which is an international agreement that our nation is also stepping into. Then in 2016, our state stepped up their game, updated their greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, triggering statewide reviews, even at some of the air quality management districts that the DEIR is quoting. And then lastly, in alignment with what our opinion is for what the DEIR should use, in 2017, our State Air Resources Board says achieving no net contribution to greenhouse gas impacts is an appropriate overall objective. So not 10,000 megatons a year, but actually zero, either not releasing emissions or doing what they can to honestly offset them to achieve what's called a net zero. So we feel as though that what they're using are old limits that don't apply here in a time now of urgent greenhouse gas emission reductions, and the DEIR would essentially allow emissions to spoil our environment for 80 years completely unchecked. Next slide, please. Now, the way that they analyzed the project is they looked at the mine in 4 parts. The first part is construction and dewatering. Again, you've already heard that we disagree that it would be only 1 year, but that is the only year that in the greenhouse gas analysis part of the report that they believe they would exceed limits, because for that 1 year of construction, they set the limits pretty small at 1,100 megatons. And that is the only year they believe that there would need to be mitigation. But now as you click through, you can see the first 5 years of operation, the mine is expected to dump their waste at the neighboring property called Centennial. And that would create about 7,200 megatons a year. Then the next 6 years after Centennial gets full, they're going to fill up the Brunswick site itself, which will take about 6 years. And then after the Brunswick mine site is filled with waste, they will then propose to truck it around the region for the next 70 years, selling it. And you can see that the annual greenhouse gas emissions are logically higher when you have to drive vehicles all around the region selling mine waste. It's going to create more greenhouse gas emissions than dumping it on your own property. So what's interesting, though, is because they've set that limit of 10,000 megatons a year, they have abandoned all efforts to offset what would equal 1.5 billion pounds of CO2. I did the math, and the DIR mitigation goal is just offset some of that first year, and then for the rest of the 80 years, between 7,000 and 9,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. Now, that is approving the release of 1.5 billion pounds of CO2. To put that into perspective, I went to an EPA.gov handy calculator for climate change and greenhouse gases. That's the equivalent of burning 800 million pounds of coal over the next 80 years. And the DEIR says that's not a problem. Don't worry about mitigating it. Next slide, please. So let's talk about not just the bad yardstick, because we feel like it shouldn't be 10,000 megatons a year, we feel like it should be zero, but they've also ignored a lot of emissions that could have potentially pushed it over the edge into mitigation. We've talked a little bit about Centennial cleanup. Right next to the mine is an old toxic mine waste site, Centennial. They're proposing to clean that up and then dump new mine waste on there. Well, that would allow them for those 5 years to not have to drive all the way around the community. For those 5 years, if Centennial is cleaned up, they could save greenhouse gas emissions by dumping next door instead of driving it elsewhere. Well, the Centennial toxic cleanup, though, is not part of our community's starting conditions. It might not even happen. And the greenhouse gas section wasn't supposed to assume that the Centennial cleanup had been done. It does anyway, and therefore gives them the benefit of the doubt. They get 5 years of lower emissions. At the same time, the report completely ignores any negative emissions from the Centennial toxic cleanup. So you get all the benefits, but none of the problems. We feel like that's inappropriate. So in our mind, it needs to either fully ignore that cleanup or fully add in the greenhouse gas impacts. You don't get to wave a magic wand and say, we'll take all of the benefits from this toxic cleanup, but we won't count any of the problems. Next slide. Then there is also the subject of cement, which doesn't get talked about much in the DEIR. And the issue is that there is a cement paste backfill in order to fill in the work that they're doing, and it will be constant. The report admits that there will be 468 cement truck trips a year, not mine waste trucks, cement trucks. Based on the payload size, that's almost 4,000 metric tons released every year to produce the cement for the mine. That greenhouse gas impact of producing cement for the mine is not included anywhere in the analysis. Now, we feel as though that number obviously would blow it right past that 10,000 arbitrary limit used for the entire 80 years of operation. So that inclusion of concrete would also trigger necessary mitigations, even if they stayed with what we feel like is the 10,000 limit. Now, under CEQA law, the DEIR doesn't have to include emissions from cement, but we know that those emissions will be there. And again, as we've said previously, the community needs to know this, that the DEIR doesn't always capture all of the impacts. Next slide. So in addition to ignoring the Centennial cleanup greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to ignoring the cement truck and the cement production emissions, there is also something that's not really talked about, and that is after all of this possible work would be done to create ore concentrates and gold concentrates, there is a nasty process to the final refinement that requires some very potentially dangerous environmental conditions, and the final steps of ore processing cannot happen here in our community. Therefore, the final ore processing has to go somewhere else. It's a chemically intensive process. So it could go to Nevada, for example, or they could ship it overseas. Now, when you are shipping this ore anywhere, there's going to be greenhouse gas emissions. And again, this is another omission of the emissions in this report because it is not included, even though we know in the real world, when they ship this ore elsewhere to be processed, it's not going to be taken there by ferries who don't emit greenhouse gas emissions. So these are some of the ways that we feel like they have missed the mark in including greenhouse gas emissions. So therefore their measurements are falsely too low. But then they've also set the yardstick way too high for what would trigger mitigation. So our concerns are that they've really left out some emissions and that they've allowed this project to potentially pollute an enormous amount, almost 1 billion pounds of coal equivalent over its lifetime. So final decisions really need to take into account the greenhouse gas impacts because we all are now feeling the effects of drought, heat waves, and increased fire. And there's no reason at all why we should allow a project like this to continue and also make all those problems worse. So last slide, please. So the key takeaway, as far as the mine's greenhouse gas emissions and this draft environmental report that we're all waiting to hear what the next stage is going to be, they've set outdated limits that are too high. They've ignored multiple sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially, they've over-allowed greenhouse gas emissions and they've undercounted what will really be associated with this project. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Sunrise Movement's efforts to pressure the county to finally step up and set our own county greenhouse gas emission limits and to set them as low as possible, you can email me at climatemartin@gmail.com and I'll forward you a link where you can do a letter to the Board of Supervisors so that the DEIR isn't tempted to shop around elsewhere for other areas that are using inappropriate measurements for our greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. In fact, when I do a presentation later, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Martin just said and what Nevada County Sunrise is doing. So thank you. That is everything from our presenters tonight. And we're going to move on to questions and answers with the panelists. We've had a few questions that have come in, but I encourage you now to use the Q&A button on the bottom and submit a question. We'll try to answer it right away. We do have a few sitting here that I'd like to direct to our panelists. So for the first one, this would be, I think, to Ralph. There's a question on what does it mean when the DEIR is recirculated? What is required and when would that happen? Ralph, do you want to answer that for us?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I can take a stab at it. Basically, what it means is they have to really redraft the draft EIR. They'll be able to reuse a lot of the materials they already have, but they'll also have to do additional studies. So how long it takes to do those studies is an open question. Some of the studies, for instance, to do well monitoring, some local hydrologists have said they would need to do well monitoring for at least 3 years to get a decent baseline. So that leaves an open question. Some of the other monitoring they need to do, such as actually measuring the water coming out of the drains for chemical toxins adequately, or the flow rates to get the better hydrology model, or even to start really sampling an adequate sample of mine rock that's been from the drill cores that Greg Thrush was talking about. Those things will all have different time frames. So it's really hard to say how long that'll all take. But basically they have to gather all that information so they can actually provide the information that is needed to make an accurate assessment of the environmental impact. So essentially, CEQA requires that the impacts of a project are well studied so that they're understandable, so the decision makers can make a decision based on good science. And so that's why the DEIR has to be recirculated. And it's really hard to put a hard number on this. Even when you think it's going to take 3 months, for instance, the first DEIR, they were talking about having it out in November of 2020 originally, and then it slipped over a year. So it's a complex process, and it also involves how much time it takes for the consultant to then take all this new data and write it up in an understandable form. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Greg, I think this one would be for you. If mine waste effluents do test beyond accepted standards, can't Rise Gold simply contain those effluents?
Yes, it could. And that's what's curious and concerning about the mine waste discussion in the DEIR. It's such a big issue, and yet it goes practically unmentioned. And while I can't get into the heads of the mine applicants and their consultants, it does make me wonder what they're thinking about on this issue. Obviously, they must know that the issue exists. They know the history of mining in this area. The only thing that I can conclude is that they're just trying to avoid drawing attention to the environmental impact of mine waste. Like, if you read the materials of Rise Gold created to attract investors, they imply that getting the permit is going to be a slam dunk. All they have to do is get 3 of 5 county supervisors to say yes, and that there aren't going to be any other regulatory agencies that have to sign off on an approved application, and that the residents of this county want this project. It appears that they either don't understand or underestimate Nevada County, both its leaders and its residents. to not notice that the DER has some serious missing parts. I don't know, while our county may have a dearth of resources to process a mine application of this scope, I imagine our county elected officials and planning staff and the committees that are in charge of looking at this proposal are being careful, methodical, listening, and thinking about the public comments that are being submitted. And by the way, it was great how many comments came in. It's just amazing. We have an incredibly active community of very curious people. And it was just inspiring. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I did read many of the comments, and I was very impressed. It was just really impressive. But there were experts that did weigh in. And as one of the experts commented on the DER, he said, and I'm paraphrasing the person now, like the DER is a rather unusual mine project proposal, given its scope and size of the operation, and that the level of information presented for the environmental review was sufficient only to consider it as a proposal for advanced exploration, not for mine development. So in other words, this expert was saying, what? This is it? This is what they're saying? And you know, it makes me feel like, I can't help but feel like someone is trying to pull a fast one on me. Like, you know, where is the information that we need to really, as a community, assess what the impacts are going to be on us if this mine happens? And the example I gave in my talk about the sampling, it's just like, it's so small for such a huge amount of area being mined. It's just kind of inconceivable that they could draw, and then the conclusions they drew were like, nope, no acid mine, which is probably true. We don't have that big of an acid mine drainage problem, but we do have other effluent problems, and we have historically. So and it's just like they were just very silent about a lot of important things, and it just feels odd. Sorry, that was a long response to.
No, that's fine. Good, very detailed. Okay, so I'm just noticing there are a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to call those out to hopefully the right people. Well, this one's addressed to Martin from Gary Griffith. Thank you, Gary. To Martin, how does the Nevada County Energy Action Plan approved in 2019? Uh-oh, it just moved on my screen. These people are typing cute questions. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I answered it, so it moved over to the answered. If you go to the top of the Q&A, click answered. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Go ahead and
Sorry
ask
about
the
that.
question anyway, because I'm curious. I'm not being able to follow that.
Yeah. Do you want to answer that one?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been a mystery to some people because folks have heard about something called the Nevada County Energy Action Plan, and it was unanimously approved by all 5 Board of Supervisors 1 year before our COVID lockdown in 2019. And what that Energy Action Plan, essentially its simplest goals are to reduce our county-wide use of natural gas and electricity. So for example, our goal is to cut our electricity use for the county in half. And what's interesting about the Energy Action Plan in relation to this project is the Energy Action Plan doesn't talk about greenhouse gas emissions at all. It's not a greenhouse gas emission reduction plan. And it doesn't meet any of the criteria under state CEQA law. When it comes to an environmental review for a project like this, there is a very specific definition for what's considered a qualified greenhouse gas emission reduction plan. And we don't actually have that here. And the Energy Action Plan is not that. And the Energy Action Plan for the county has no teeth. It's almost like the Paris Climate Agreement. There's no consequences. There's no reason why they have to meet any of the goals. And to be honest, the county really hasn't been trying to meet any of the goals because it's completely voluntary. It's just a nice official suggestion at the county level. Hey, everyone, reduce your energy use this much by this time. But the county's been dragging their feet. And again, it isn't an official policy with teeth, with requirements, with consequences. And again, it specifically has no mention really about setting greenhouse gas emission goals for the county. And this is actually where this new Nevada County chapter of Sunrise Movement is specifically targeting this donut hole in our community's policy. We don't have a policy for greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I did give, when I first was asked to speak at one of these seminars for MineWatch and CEA, it was August of last year, and I specifically did talk all about the energy use at the mine and how poorly all of the reports address this project's complete disconnect with our community's desire to use less energy represented by the Energy Action Plan. Short and sweet, this mine as proposed would use as much electricity as the entire unincorporated county already does. So it would practically double the non-commercial existing electricity use for our community. To put that in perspective, for that same amount of power that the mine proposes to use, we create roughly 30 to 40,000 jobs in our community for the same amount of electricity that the mine proposes to use. The mine's proposing to use that same amount of power and deliver maybe 300 jobs. So it's really pathetic from an energy perspective. And we decided to not go too deep at all into the Energy Action Plan because the DEIR gets to completely ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. Because again, the Board of Supervisors voted for it unanimously, but they voted unanimously for something that has no teeth and is not officially recognized in any of these CEQA processes. Sad but true.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Okay, I have about 4 more questions. And just to give folks a sense, our plan is to end at 7:30. So we do have time for more questions. So from David Agrin, he asks a question about how is the board feeling? I think I'm going to send this to you, Ralph. So you might listen to what this question is. How is the board feeling? Are they more favorable or less favorable given the election results? And he sees that the election results are ultimately being supportive of the no mine, of not having a mine. He realizes that none of them can state a clear position ahead of time, as they would need to recuse themselves from a final vote. And he says no specifics needed, but are you feeling better or worse? So what's a temperature read on this?
I think it's a toss-up at this point. So it might hinge somewhat on the final election for the Grass Valley District. But it's too close to call either way. And I just really couldn't say which way I feel they're going to go. I think actually, if the community continues to make the case, and if we continue to basically try to get out more and more information about the impacts of this project, that there's a good chance the board would unanimously turn it down. And that is what I like to imagine happening, and that is what we're working towards. And I think that's possible. So that's our goal.
Great. Thanks, Ralph. Okay, a question from Renette Otto. Rice sent out propaganda stating that the economic report shows home values will not be negatively impacted and may actually increase property values. So her question is, are county officials aware of their disinformation campaign, meaning Rise Gold's disinformation campaign, and will they take that under consideration when deciding on this project? And what is the economic report ETA? Who wants to take this question? Ralph, should I send this one to you, or maybe it's Greg?
Well, I can try.
Okay.
We don't really know when the economic report will be published. It was originally scheduled to be published already, I think in April, but I also got information from the consultant that they're actually waiting to get some feedback from the draft, like I mentioned in my introduction. So it's really unknown when it's going to be published. They might be just waiting until the final EIR comes out now. I'm not really clear on that. But you know, if you look at real estate, well, what the realtors are all saying, and if you look at other communities that have had a mine in them, there's really no argument that property values will go up. The caveat is, in a rising market, if all the houses are going up, say 30%, you know, maybe the houses around a mine will go up 10%. So, you know, you might be able to say that the prices have been going up even though there's a mine in some circumstances, but I think generally it's a negative in that I don't really see a lot of people lining up wanting to live right next to a noisy, dusty mining operation with a bunch of big commercial equipment and trucks driving around. I think I'd like to give our county officials credit with having enough objectivity to understand that a lot of these advertisements from basically any developer does this. They try to put as positive a spin on their project as possible. And certainly Rise Gold has taken that to new heights. So hopefully they are not getting too influenced by that and can keep an objective mind. So when a real study comes out, they can make a real decision. I don't know if somebody else wants to add to that, but
Oh,
I
that
think you're
sounds
right,
good.
Ralph. I think that, you know, real estate values will probably be more affected for the real estate closer to the mine. It also depends on, you know, what the you know, the effects of what the reality of the mining operation is. If there are trucks running through neighborhoods every day and the impact is what we expect it to be, I imagine it's going to have a big impact on people's interest and desirability of the real estate that will be impacted by that. So,
And I would also add to that, I mean, if people's wells are at risk of going dry or not producing enough water, and there's no alternate water supply for them, their property values are not going to go up.
Yeah.
They're going to go down and may make their house unsellable.
even the possibility of that is enough to hurt the
Right.
value of a house.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions connected with groundwater and water itself. One is, how long will it actually take to get a baseline on groundwater? Ralph, I think that would be you, right?
Well, like I said, I think it was Steve Baker and then another hydrologist I talked to said that to do it right, you really need several years of groundwater monitoring where you monitor from wells directly. And even in the some of the expert reports, they said that also you should include usage rates because you have to account for dry years, wet years. You know, if you do that, you're measuring in a wet year, you might have a false image of what it would be, or a dry year, vice versa. So to do it right, it's going to take several years. I imagine that the mine doesn't want to do it for more than a week, so we'll have to fight that out and see what they end up deciding.
Thank you. Another question back to you, Greg. Is asbestos a water contaminant?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think so. I think that, I mean, asbestos can go into any substance. It could get into, like if I had an piece of asbestos and I hosed it down and that water washed into a waterway, sure, that asbestos would go down. It could theoretically just wash up on a shore somewhere, dry out and blow away. Yeah. But I think the biggest concern about asbestos is the fact that this excavating, processing, and hauling and dumping vast quantities of rock, a lot of it, you know, some of it will have asbestos, contain asbestos, is a very easy vector for air contamination. I mean, just imagine like dumping a dump truck of rocks onto a pile. And I know that that they're in the asbestos management report that they talk about, their mitigation would be basically to hose the waste as it comes out of the truck onto the disposal site, which would help some, at least for 5 or 10 minutes until, you know, the water dries, you know, in 100-degree weather and the wind blows or whatever, and then off it goes, right?
Okay.
You know, it's I'm not clear about all the vectors for asbestos, but I think primarily it's air. And one of the interesting things is that the EPA has set no limit for a minimum amount of asbestos to be considered harmful. They're basically saying any amount of asbestos is bad for you. So you don't need to breathe very much of it for it to have an impact.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Here's another question. It looks like we have two more after this, and then we'll move back to what actions we're taking this summer. So what provisions are in RISE's proposal currently to allow future county, state, and federal environmental requirements to apply to their project? I'm thinking that might be Ralph. It might also be Paul Schwartz.
I think if I understand the question, if the project were approved now and then standards changed or regulations changed, how would that affect the mine? I'm thinking of greenhouse gas emissions in particular. If you imagine that, say, some threshold is set like 1,000 metric tons and the mine got approved, and then later on they passed a law that clamp down further, would that impact the mine? I know there's something about being grandfathered in, which makes it harder to change established businesses and established emissions. So it would probably take a more specifically, forceful regulatory body to actually cause them to dial it back. It's just like once you see a polluter, is established, like a coal-fired plant is emitting, it's hard to get it to shut down. It takes a lot more effort because they're already established. But I couldn't answer the question other than that. Sorry. Don't know.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Okay, last two questions. There might be another question in the Q&A and I'll look. This one actually I think would be to Christy Hubbard. We've heard from Mike tonight about water and the impact to well owners. What has the Nevada Irrigation District, NID, done in particular on this issue? Because we know that they gave comments on the Planning Commission meeting. Could you give a quick little synopsis of what NID did?
Yeah, actually, we were very pleased that NID really got into this because they're very concerned about it as well. Yeah, when they spoke at the Planning Commission meeting, they too basically said, you've got to be kidding, right? I'm not really, that's not what their actual words, but they basically said 30 wells is not enough. 30 homes coverage is not an appropriate mitigation. When they went in there, they actually asked for 2 other neighborhoods to be given the exact same privileges as that group of 30 homes. They also asked for well monitoring for a number of other neighborhoods, including in the areas of Greenhorn, Woodrose, and the Beaver Drive areas. And on top of that, they simply finished it off by saying, and we need a $14 million bond just to protect and have what we would need if the worst happens to these well owners in this area, right? Because the whole idea really is that RISE is trying, and Mike said this so well, right? RISE would love everybody to believe that there's just this one little tiny area at risk, but the mineral rights are so much bigger than that, and they have an 80-year lease, right? So being able to actually assess the risk across the whole of the area, not just the mineral rights, but even beyond that, because we know that with the fractured rock geology that we have, that those risks can go beyond. So we were very pleased that NID really came in and said, no, we really need a lot bigger scope, and we need more money to cover it if bad things happen.
Okay, we actually do have 2 more questions. Oh, it looks like one might be answered. Sorry, my apologies. But there is one question from Patty Timms. Thank you, Patty. Where are they going to get this water? Are they going to truck it in?
water for NID?
I believe, yes. So in the context of well owners, how will they get the water if it's needed?
Well, the water for the properties on East Bennett, they would put a NID pipeline up East Bennett and then run water lines to the affected property, 30 properties. So they would be opening up the roadway, running the pipes up there, and then closing that all up and putting more asphalt down. And I don't know if they included that in their greenhouse gas emissions report or not, but that would be the plan for those 30 properties. It would be piped water.
Right. Ralph, can you add more?
Yeah, so if you look at Rise Gold's own study, they show, I think it's 242 wells over the mineral rights and beyond already, which their own hydrology study showed would have groundwater drops between 1 and 10 feet. And we feel that that study really missed the boat. And we estimate there are over 300 wells in the area that, and maybe many more that could be affected. And if you really wanted to match what the county approved back in 1996, when there's a permit just to dewater the mine, that's not with mining, just dewatering it. So there's no expansion of tunnels or anything. They were requiring that temporary water was set up and plans and infrastructure permits and everything were all ready to go, so that within 24 hours, anybody who lost water could get temporary water and within a short period of time get hooked up. So if you put that whole concept into an area of 300 or more property owners who they don't even have water lines run, there aren't even easements to run to a lot of these properties. So to really do it right, they need to establish easements for all these properties and design and plan for all the mains that would go in, and design to have the temporary water on hand in order to provide emergency water if they have a problem, and then be able to supply them all. This is a massive undertaking, and I think that's why NID came up with $14 million. And that would probably be just for what they would have to get in order to do the mains. You know, there may be more to it than that. So it really is a significant problem, and we'll be curious to see what kind of a solution the Rise Gold comes up with, and whether it's even credible. We'll have to wait and find out.
Right. Great. Thanks, Ralph. Okay, I think with that, we've gone through all of our questions. If you feel like we didn't answer your question, I encourage you now to send an email with that question. You can always try to put it in the Q&A now, and we'll see if we can catch it in time. Or send your question to mineconcerns@cea-nc.org. Maybe we can save that in the chat. If somebody could write that in the chat, please feel free to send an email there and we'll get back to you and answer your question. Right now, Josie's trying to struggle with Google Slides and show you a little bit more about what we're planning for this summer. So while we're waiting for that to come up, I'll give you an idea. There we go. So how to take action for this summer. So next slide, please, Josie. All right. So first up, I think everybody here has signed the petition, but if not, please go and do that. And more importantly, share it with your friends. Signing the petition is a great way to tell the supervisors your position on the mine, but it's also a way for us to build our numbers. And so now we're into the thousands on the petition. So thank you for doing that. After you sign the petition, take it one step further. We would love for you to write a letter directly to your supervisor. We have materials on our website to help you do that. So please visit Take Action on our website, and also write a letter to the Grass Valley City Council. Okay. We have a few more ideas here for you to do. And a big one is also to contribute money to support the MineWatch campaign. Your financial support gives us the resources we need to win this. And we have been so successful because of the financial support we've received from grants, but mainly from the community. So please, there's a link right on the front page of our website. Go there, contribute money, and keep us moving ahead. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to talk about 3 things you can do this summer. And it's all about fun this summer, my friends. So summer activities, first of all, join us. Mark your calendars now for July 31st at 5 o'clock at Pioneer Park. There is going to be a free concert and community picnic for us to celebrate what we've done literally for the last 2 years, more than 2 years. So let's take this moment in the summer, now that, let's say it's a different climate, and join us at Pioneer Park so we can celebrate our successes over the last 2 years. Second is that we'll be tabling at lots of different events with the petition. And the one that I know of now is at the county fair. So if you're going to the county fair in August, come by the table, visit us. We will be asking people to sign up and see if you'd like to volunteer and join us at the table. That would be wonderful. So do that. And finally, third is Nevada County Sunrise has a climate change letter. Martin touched on it, and it's about setting the greenhouse gas limits for the county. We will be sending out in our next newsletter a link so that you can fill in that letter, or you can also email Martin as he suggested. He gave you his email address. We'll be sending out a link to that letter so that you can fill it in. But we also encourage you to take it one more step further there and to send in a letter to your county supervisor. So those are some of the summer activities that we have people focused on. You've heard about other things that might be happening with the economic study. If you're on this webinar, you're now on our newsletter list, and we'll keep you updated on everything we're doing. And the last word here is our motto: together we can stop the mine. Thank you for all of your work. There are so many people who have joined here tonight, nearly 100 people registered, and I know so many names that I've recognized, and we all recognize for all the work they've done. So thank you. Thank you for coming tonight and joining us, and have a good evening.